we are thrilled to see you all here bright and early this Friday for what I think is a vitally important plenary panel this morning talking about movement building with really a powerhouse lineup of speakers who are all mobilizing different constituencies for peace in different ways. Now, before we get to them, I wanted to share some good news and make a few announcements today and some welcomes and thank yous. First of all, I want to thank Kennesaw State University for coming in as a sponsor for this conference and for sending such an incredible delegation of students to join us today. So could our Kennesaw delegation, our Kennesaw students stand up? Thank you for coming forward to support this event. Thank you for traveling all the way from Georgia, and thank you for what you represent, which is the future of peace building. And on that note, I'm happy to welcome students of all of AFP's member universities. Today, this Friday, we've made our student day. They are invited guests. So if we have any other students here, college and high school, would you stand up so we can thank you for joining us? Further on the student side, I want to thank our senior fellow, Patricia Schaefer, for bringing, Patricia, thank you, for bringing a remarkable delegation of high school students here yesterday from New Gen Peace Builders. They had a terrific session on youth-led peace building, and for those of you who were not able to join it, because I know we had so many events going on at once, we have taped the whole thing and we are going to put it out as a video, and I really commend it to all of you because as we talk about youth, I think we have to really make it real in terms of listening and elevating their leadership in our network. So Patricia, thank you for all of your fine work there, and we look forward to giving that more circulation. Yeah. So, New Gen Peace Builders, could you stand up? Great. I'd encourage you all during the coffee breaks to seek these students out, and they are really doing amazing work, bridging differences in communities and moving forward. So thank you for that. Finally, I just want to issue a effusive thanks to our incredible volunteers. They have been working behind the scenes, literally from the crack of dawn to well past sunset to make this event a success. So can we give a round of applause to our volunteers? So I'm happy to share that we have another short film for you today, and I promise it's not the AFP logo, it's something different. This morning, we have greetings to all of you from the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Eliot Engel, and the ranking Republican member, Mike McCall, who are the first recipients of the Alliance for Peacebuilding Champions Award. Now, we made this decision to recognize them based on their bipartisan leadership, really at a moment of unprecedented polarization and division, in favor of peaceful prevention. Representative McCall and Engel have been the leaders of the effort to adopt the Global Fragility Act in the U.S. Congress. It was passed in the House in May with no opposition and 21 Republican and Democrat sponsors. They also put forward new legislation that will protect U.S. assistance to Central America, assistance that is targeting the drivers of violence from future cuts. So it's my pleasure to share a message from these two representatives where they are expressing their gratitude and their support for your efforts. Thank you. There was quite a party going on. You can hear the music in the background.
Honored to have received received a wonderful award from such a prestigious organization. You know, when we look back at all the work we've done in Congress and other places, the thing that's most appropriate, that gives us the most good feeling, is working for peace. And this organization and other organizations have worked for peace for many, many years. And it's a situation where, of course, you have to keep working. Otherwise, peace is easily losable. And so I want to just say I get a lot of awards, but to get it from a group such as this that's so meaningful really makes me feel very happy. Mike McCall and I put our heads together with the Fragile States Bill and with many other things on the Foreign Affairs Committee, because we believe that partisanship should stay at the water's edge. That when America is at her best, it's when all Americans are working together in a bipartisan fashion. And when Congress is at its best, it's the same thing. So Mike McCall and I have decided that we're making a number of bills our priority, and this bill is certainly one of our top priorities, and I hope in the not too distant future, because it has passed the House, we just need to get it through the Senate, we can all celebrate after the bill passes the Senate and is signed into law by the President. So I want to thank you for everything that you've done and everything you continue to do. The world is obviously a safer and better place with people like yourselves, but we still unfortunately have a long way to go. But I am confident that with energy and good intentions and with hard work, we're going to achieve peace in the world. Thank you.
Hi, I'd like to thank the Alliance for Peace Building for this prestigious inaugural award, alongside with my good friend Chairman Elliot Engel. We believe that working together as not Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans, we can really make a difference in the world. And I think the Global Fragility Act is a good example of that, to get to the prevention piece of extremism in the world. We've done a good job, I think, defending the nation. The military's done a good job offensively. We haven't done the prevention piece well to achieve peace throughout the world. And so I'm very excited about this new organization, your alliance, working together with the Foreign Affairs Committee to get great things done, not just for the American people, but for the world, because when the world's safer, America's safer. Thanks again. I'm just very honored to receive this great award.
Great. Now, I think it has to be said that House adoption of the Global Fragility Act would not have occurred without a 2-year effort by a coalition of 65 organizations in our network, led by Mercy Corps and the Alliance. And we want to thank all 65 of those coalition members. I want to recognize the efforts of Liz Hume, of Richmond Blake, of Laura Strawmeyer in really making this outcome possible. But I also want to recognize an additional leader, Madeline Rose, who conceived the idea for the Global Fragility Act. Way to go, Madeline. She is leading our new movement building campaign, Plus Peace, and I can't think of a better person to introduce this panel, What Works? Building a Modern Movement. Thank you, Madeline.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for such a great, fun, rich couple of days. I will be really short here, but just before we kick off the movement building panel, I am a person who really lives and thinks in quotes. So if everyone in the back can't see this, this quote says, "I wish there was a movement for peace today like there was for HIV/AIDS in the 90s, but there isn't. Until you build it, until folks are up here throwing blood on the walls of Congress, you aren't going to get much more than what you've got." This was a quote from September 2016, when we first started advocating for the Global Fragility Act in the US Congress. I know this quote makes some peace builders uncomfortable, but I think it's really important to, and who it was from. So this was a quote from, basically in the US Congress, there's about 8 people who end up writing the US Foreign Assistance Bill. there's kind of a top 8 who at the end of the day are responsible line for line for how State Department and USAID is funded. And this was a direct quote from one of those 8. Obviously, we persisted. The peace-building community continued to advocate and find our way to advocate for what has become possibly the U.S. government's most flagship effort to support the global peace-building and violence prevention community. But this quote has stuck with me ever since as a benchmark, in a way, for our community to think about, where do we go from here? Right? The peace-building community, everyone in this room, you have all played an incredible role in building a strong, resilient, sophisticated, dynamic peace-building community. But what do we need to do to take that from a community to a movement? Right? Why is it that policymakers and politicians still tell us we don't have a movement? And what does that mean for us? What are we called to do then to leverage the assets of this room, of the peace-building community, to generate and show that we do have a public movement for peace building? So with that, I'm very excited to introduce our new panel. I am going to just introduce the moderator, and he'll bring everyone up. So if everyone could join me on the floor. We're really excited to have Michael Silberman here. He's the Global Director of Mobilization Lab. So Mobilization Lab is a newish entity that's completely dedicated to helping social movements do their work better. He's an expert on movement building, on coalition building, on social change, on leveraging evidence, narratives, stories, all of those pieces, how you put all those pieces into a puzzle for building social movements. So Michael is going to moderate our next panel, and we'll take you to about 10:40. So Michael and everyone, come on up.
Thanks, Madeline, and good morning again, everyone. I'd like to start with a quick story that I only discovered this week, because 50 years ago, on Wednesday, I think, on the 2nd, it was 1969. I want to take you back. I guess some of you were actually in 1969. I personally was not, so hopefully this is a good memory for some of you. But if you can imagine, just look around, there were more than, some of them are lost in their memories, more than 10,000 people, so imagine a room like us times however many, physically occupying the Canada-US border, which were more people than had ever been in that location since the War of 1812. And some of you may or may not be able to guess. Some of you are more familiar with this story than others, but this was in opposition to the US government's planned nuclear weapons testing on the Aleutian Islands. And the reason there were tens of thousands of people around the world and physically on the border putting their bodies on the line for peace was in large part something that happened, I think, several years building, where a small group of activists learned about what was supposedly going to happen, what the plans were, and said, this is not the future we want to live in. And they said, let's raise some money and find someone who can lend us a rinky-dink little boat, and we're actually going to make it clear enough to the world that this cannot stand, and we will take our boat into the nuclear testing zone and risk our lives for peace. And so at one point, a reporter said, called and said, what do you want from this? This was just like a scrappy activist committee group, and they said, well, we want a green and peaceful future. And you might be able to guess, this then became the logo they painted on the sails, Greenpeace. And when these activists came back, unfortunately unsuccessful in stopping that particular bombing and test that would have all these horrible impacts on communities and the planet, they found what they didn't expect, which was the beginning of a global movement working for peace and the environment. And and ultimately what became many more Greenpeaces popping up organically all around the world, which is where I found myself in 2011 and started to hear the beginnings of that story and started to get some inspiration. And in 2011, Greenpeace was looking back, and perhaps like some of you, looking at the world around us and saying, well, it's actually a lot more complex out there today than it ever was. Disrupted, I think, is what we had on the screen. There are people-powered movements for change emerging much more quickly than ever before, not just this small group of activists who could drive change and lead these mind bomb communication efforts and catalyze action through mass media, but instead we have this much more fragmented world where things can happen more quickly and at larger scales, and it's complicated and confusing, and it's harder to work within in many times. And so that's the genesis of where the Mob Lab started. Madeline already told you a bit about what we do. We now, after working with Greenpeace for 5 years to help Greenpeace rethink what it means to campaign in more collaborative, participatory ways that transform systems for the long term, we now have the privilege of being able to work with more groups around the world, guiding, coaching, and leading them through similar work. So when people ask us, where do we look for inspiration, and what's the front lines of social change? Unfortunately, we often don't point back to the big branded institutions that we get to work with. We usually look towards social movements, because that's where things are moving the fastest. That's where that's where people are innovating more quickly and taking more risks and trying new things, and also catalyzing action in ways that that we often don't see in traditional civil society groups. I personally believe we need the mix to succeed, and so anyway, that's why I'm particularly excited to be here with this incredible panel. That will be the end of me yapping here, and because my job here is to ask questions and help us all learn from our incredible guests, our movement builders, change makers who are here. I hope you will check out their fuller bios, because we're not going to spend a bunch of time going through all of their accolades, because we could fill the time doing that. I will invite you to think about the questions that you have as well, because after a few rounds of us getting to talk up here, I'm hoping there's a way that we can get a mic moving as well to surface the questions that you have that will make this session useful to you. And as Madeline said, I'm hoping we can surface lessons and learnings about modern movement building that we can all apply to growing the peace community. And so I will do my best to, and we will all do our best to hopefully make those connections from our experiences, but also hope you will join us in that effort as we move ahead in the session. Did I miss anything important? Probably not, because that was long enough. Okay. So I would love to start with you, Bria, who happens to be conveniently seated right next to me. I think one of the most exciting things we've probably all collectively been watching and seeing or participating in, hopefully, is the March for Our Lives efforts and movements. You've been playing a national organizing role with March for Our Lives, as well as some more traditional institutions, which I'm eager to talk about later. But I think the one thing that struck me in the last couple of weeks was hearing Greta, from one of the initiators of the climate strikes, talk about how she, after looking back at how 4 million people were mobilized, young people and grown-ups, do we call, were walked out of work and school all around the world just in the last week. There was an interview question that some of you may have seen that said, like, well, what inspired you to think you could do this, right? You could launch a global, and she said, well, I watched some of the Americans and March for Our Lives, and I saw what was possible. And so that really hit me. And so there's obviously, it seems to me, and I think probably many people, there's a wave of youth-led social movement action and energy, more than I think a lot of us have seen in a while. And I'm curious, like, being in the center of it, what do you see changing? What is the trend that is emerging, and what do people who have been working in maybe for decades in social change need to be maybe thinking differently about today?
Always make the young people answer the questions first. Just kidding. But that's a good question. I think when you talk about like social justice movements, we tend to forget that a lot of the social justice movements in our history of this country were led by young people who were really pissed off, upset about our futures, and scared to live in a society, and we haven't fallen to a place of complacency that, okay, this is just how it's going to be. And at times you see these patterns of adults and grown-ups saying, we're just going to accept it, this is how it's going to be complacent, listen to the government, listen to our system, move on, go to work, do your 9 to 5, and die. And I guess like a lot of times in social justice, I mean, but that's factual. Like we have this like sense of urgency to get things done and never disrupt ourselves because we want to have this complacency, this comfortability. And at times, like March for Our Lives didn't want to deal with that complacency. We didn't want to be told, oh, thoughts and prayers by politicians because our friends are being shot and killed on the streets and in school. That complacency kills lives. That complacency doesn't let legislation become passed in Congress. That complacency literally is what happens to lots of people when you do not have a platform to speak up against injustices that are affecting you. And I think it's really funny within the social justice movement because like adults will be like, thank you so much for, we really messed up, and you guys are really having all the weight on your shoulders. And I'm like, you're still living. Like we can collectively do this together. Social justice movements isn't about age or gender, sexual orientation. It doesn't discriminate because injustice doesn't. Everyone is affected, whether you are directly or indirectly. And so I think a lot of times, like when we have this generational gap or this generational distrust, because in the beginning of March for Our Lives, we were like, no adults. Adults do not listen to young people. And adults were complacent with that. And that was like the big issue because that complacency is what really drives young people into these like positions that we shouldn't be in the first place. And I say that not to be joking that you guys are still alive, but because that's so serious. I think that a lot of times, like young people, we have all these all these issues on our shoulders, and in social justice movements today, we are told that young people are going to be the revolutionaries for tomorrow, but I'm literally talking to my mom, and she's helping things with me, and I can't do a lot of things without adults, without the help or without the connection and with the trust of older generations, because I don't know all the answers in the world. I don't know everything that happens within a social justice movement, but there's mentors, there's people who are wise and who want to help me as well, that we can all do this collectively together. So that's why I really love this panel and speaking with energized grown-ups who want to be a part of this change, who want to be a part of this conversation and not just focusing on young people to tokenize them and make them so extremely tired and forcing everything on their backs because we think that young people are the face of change when every person in this room has a place and a seat at the table to be in that conversation of change. But going back to Greta, I think that was true, that's really true. And it's interesting to see how much social movements take from other social movements. Like we see the Black Lives Matter movement or the Civil Rights movement back in the 60s. I remember speaking with the co-founders of March for Our Lives, and they were saying that they literally took a lot of like those elements of that social justice movement and morphed it into the gun violence movement because you see they're all on the same foundation. It's injustice, with the complacency of politicians not being held accountable, and it's people literally begging and screaming for their lives every single day because people who look like me or people who look like you are being shot down and killed, and no one's getting coverage for it. So I think with that adaptation and taking different traits and similarities, you see the March for Our Lives movement last year in 2018 pulled in millions of people, and there was millions of Americans marching on the soil of America all across the country. And after that, young people were coming out of the crevices. They were coming out of the narratives that we are told to just graduate and get a 9 to 5, and they're actually activating and advocating for their lives. And with March for Our Lives, we have more than 300 chapters across the country of young people going to universities, having voter reg parties and registrations at their colleges, at their high schools, even at their workplaces, and getting these people into this conversation that if we do not have a collective dialogue that we need to be ahead of what's happening, then we are going to be repeating the same things that's been happening that got us to this same point. And I don't mean to like scream at adults or grown-ups and say like, help, but honestly, help. This isn't just a conversation of just young people, oh, they're doing so great. Like, she's such a great speaker. She's so eloquent. She's so articulate. I'm literally begging and advocating for people who cannot sit in this seat right now. I'm sitting for him, and I'm telling them that we need to have this platform to be diverse. We need people to come in there, and we need to not just listen to messages because they're so inspiring and young people are like changing the dialogue, because young people I'm 18. I think I'm pretty adult now. I mean, I'm in college. That's kind of cool. But like, I want this to not just be that generational gap between my community and that community, because sometimes we're not always taken seriously. We're used as tokenized props in like this game of advocacy, because if we don't have young people, then it's not serious. But then at times when we're taking in so much, we're absorbing in so much, we're digesting, and we're still advocating for our lives, we're still not being invited to that conversation. So I know I talked about so many different things, not yelling at grown-ups, all these different things, but I think Greta made a good point about what made her want to come to America, is because this is a country of revolutionaries. We want to see a difference in our country because we know how great it can be, the potential that we have, and the young people that are being activated and galvanized each and every day. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to galvanize these people. We need to invite young people into these spaces, be present in this time, and want to be. I know we have next-gen people in these seats as well, and I'm looking at you guys because I know y'all my age. But I think we need to invite them into these spaces and listen to the things that we're talking about, because yes, we can activate the older generations and activate the smaller generations in different spaces, but why not do it collectively together so everyone's on the same page?
Thanks, Bria. I want to come back to you in a bit as well to talk more about how these movements come together and might work together better. You talked about changing the dialogue, so I want to jump over to Claire for a few minutes here and hear a bit about your experience working with narrative shifts and culture change work, especially when I think there's a contrast here. You know, we see a lot of movement moments that emerge when an event is happening in the world, and you were working in very early days on period poverty that before it was a term that people were familiar with, and kind of driving a narrative shift and change and growing awareness, and you won an Academy Award for the work and many other, and have had millions of people, you've reached millions of people through this work. And I'd love to just, if you could start just by telling us a bit more about what are some of the lessons over the years that you've found for us all in driving this kind of culture change or narrative change, especially in the absence of moments to react to in the news.
Yeah, that's a really great question. First of all, I just want to thank you guys and for the Alliance for Peace Building for putting on such an amazing and I think diverse conference with really, really rich conversations. And to my cousin, Robert Berg, for having connected me with this organization for so many years and for all the work that he has done. So I'm just really happy to be here, and especially, like I said, with such a diverse group of people. And I think that we're all doing different things that relate to peace in a lot of kind of intricate and nuanced ways. And I think that that is especially special because it's kind of at the frontier of this new way that we think about peace building and peace in general. So I completely agree with everything that you have been saying when it comes to making social change and enacting this kind of change. On my end, I think that where I came from and where sort of my work started was back in high school too. It started with being a part of just like a small high school club where we talked about gender equality and we talked about access to education and like these very sort of basic principles of human rights. And we were fortunate enough to sort of have this community of people where we were able to engage in this sort of dialogue. And it was actually at the UN Commission on the Status of Women that we heard about this issue of period poverty. And it wasn't even described as period poverty at the time. There was just this sort of vague understanding that at the time, sort of the understanding was that in a lot of developing countries, women and girls don't have access to like hygienic menstrual products that they can afford. For a number of kind of really substantive, like structural reasons, and that can be the impetus for a lot of girls dropping out of school at young ages and sort of the devaluation of girls' education. And this was about 7 years ago when I was a freshman in high school. And I think, like you mentioned, we had this sort of this drive that I think a lot of youth have to make an impact, but at the time, and I think that this is the case for a lot of youth, we didn't really have like the resources to do anything about it other than have conversations or try to encourage other people to understand our viewpoint or to raise awareness. And so what we decided to do was take that basic ability to educate other people and try and increase that scale. And so we started raising money for a pad machine for communities that we learned how to partner with. We tried to tackle this issue head on, and I think that because the topic was not very widely discussed, like you mentioned, social movements emerge from these moments of like discovery or maybe these moments of like outrage. And so that's really what happened for us. And that's, I think, why so many people have caught on to the work that we've been doing and why they've been so moved, why people are now watching period, end of sentence, and are feeling inspired to at least start talking about periods more openly. And I think that that's because we, as the people who started the PAD project, decided to be open about these conversations too. And so I think that in creating this film and in starting these dialogues, we've been able to make what has historically, and especially in particular communities, been such an extreme taboo, and we've just like brought it to the forefront. I have no discomfort talking about menstruation, about women's health anymore, and neither should you, neither should anybody. And I think that because that there is a such deeply rooted stigma surrounding the topic, it makes people scared to talk about it, so no one talks about it. And then when there are social issues that are really systematic, that arise from those topics, people are uncomfortable talking about them too. And so I think unless we are talking about these concepts, unless we're talking about periods, there is really no way to delve into the deeper challenges that people face when they don't necessarily have the products to manage their period, or when their period becomes a source of cultural shame, or when it results in them not being able to attend school, which should be like a basic human right.
Thank you. While we're talking about women and girls and empowerment, and Gulala, I want to hear more about the work you've been doing. We got to meet many folks at PeaceCon have already gotten to hear a bit about your experience. You're doing this work in Pakistan and in a region where I think many people have thought about are thinking about peace and are working on related issues. And I'm curious, when you started your organization over a decade ago, I believe? Is it? 2 decades ago. Tell us, how did you decide that this is, what was it that inspired you to take this essentially very risky action, right? Even probably more, certainly more so even 20 years ago. And how has the work that your organization has been doing been part of, which is not necessarily labeled peace work, right? On the face of it all the time, actually be part of a larger peace movement?
Thank you. When I was starting my work on women empowerment and peace building, it was peace building. I did not know what kind of risks I was subscribing to. Only 20 years later, I knew that what it would really mean to me. But I believe that whenever people become parts of movement, when they start movements or organizations, there is always a personal trigger to it. And the movement sustains, the activism sustains when you have a personal reason to be part of the movement, to be part of the cause. When I was growing up, today everyone is so much aware, like we know peace building work today. We are so much familiar with the word of countering violent extremism, and violent extremism. But when I was growing up in 1990s, it was not a term which was known globally, but I was already living the reality of extremism. I grew up in community where there would be wall chalking for recruitment for young people in militant groups. So while many of you grew up when you would go to school, there would be maybe wall chalkings for being recruited in a school club or a sports club. I grew up in a community where there were wall chalkings and there would be huge demonstrations by extremists, by militants who would call for young people to join jihad because being killed in jihad was something that young people shall be aspire to. So I came out from that place, and where from my own personal experiences, I learned what make young people vulnerable to joining extremist groups, because I was growing up there and I was also being indoctrinated by the extremist ideology. But thanks to my father, who was a human rights activist and who identified at a very young age that I have also indoctrinated the extremist ideology, and he used a model of inclusion. He made sure that I'm able to reach out to alternative narratives. When I was growing up in a community where there was so much talk about extremism and being recruited in extremist organizations, my father provided me with the opportunity to learn about other movements of non-violence, to learn about pluralism, to learn about tolerance. And when I learned it, I knew that the experiences I have, I shall extend those experiences to other young people who are living in that same community, vulnerable to those to the same narratives of extremism. So we started, Sabah and I, my sister who is sitting here, in 2002, when I was 16, she was 15, we co-founded this initiative, Aware Girls, as a way to empower young women and to prevent young people from joining extremist groups. When I talk about peace building, and as a woman who has grown in a very patriarchal society, for me, peace building does not come without speaking about inclusion of women, inclusion of young women, because if young women are excluded from governance, if young women are excluded from decision making, we cannot talk about peace, because we are making half of the world. If we are not part of the decisions, then I don't know how do we even make peace or build peace movements without women being part of it. So we started this organization. We started working on political empowerment of young women, providing political leadership skills, leadership trainings on human rights, and with the work that we had been doing, we were able to inspire thousands of girls and young women to be active citizens and responsible citizens in their communities, to be face of the change that they want to see in their communities and their lives. When we started Youth Peace Network in 2009, when we started a more specific program to counter extremism, through the Youth Peace Network, we have already reached to more than 10,000 young people who were vulnerable to extremist organizations and prevented them from being recruited using a peer-to-peer education model. We recruit young people, we identify young people who are potential peace activists, build their capacity as peace builders. They reach out to other young people in their communities, engage them, we provide them with alternative opportunities of engagement in social movement for justice, social movement for development, so that they can see their potential. And we celebrate potential of young people. We are working towards building social cohesion by bringing together different people, such as organizing interfaith dialogue, intercultural dialogue, and intergeneration dialogue, because that is so important, that people who have lived in different eras, people who have lived different values, people who have different cultures, ethnicities, they come together and celebrate diversity, because that's how we break the process of otherization. The more we come together, the more we see each other as human beings, the more we defeat extremism. So that's how, that's what we have been doing. And little did I know that this work, which may sound so innocent, when become powerful and when started having an impact, then there are some challenges too, and you have to pay a price as well.
And yeah, let's. And I want to make sure we come back and hear a little bit more in a minute about what it's like working in that kind of a challenging context. And also want to get to Rebecca in a second. But while I want to come back to Bria first for a minute. I'm curious, as you hear about the violence being described in Gulalai's story, how that resonates for you. You've been talking a lot about interconnectedness and intersectionality of movements and struggles for justice, which I think is, it's increasingly also a buzzword, if I can say that. Like, I'm not sure, it's something that I think lots of campaigners and social change makers are thinking, this is something we need to think about, and that yes, of course, all struggles are connected in some way, but I'm not sure it's always clear to people working for social change about what that means, how we apply that, what we do. And I'd certainly love to hear some of your specific experience ensuring that March for Our Lives became something that was more representative of everyone suffering violence. I see you're wearing Black Lives Matter earrings right now. But you did a lot of pretty critical early change work, as far as I understand. And I'm curious, whether it's through that experience or your others, could you tell us more about how to think, how we all need to be thinking, anyone in any kind of change-making context needs to be thinking about some of these connections and solidarity and working kind of beyond our maybe issue area or whatever is specifically written exactly in our mission statement as the issues we work on.
Sure, yeah. When you said that intersectionality is definitely a buzzword in the social justice movement, I agree, because I feel a lot of people who say intersectionality do not really know what that word means, because it's so hard to define a term that shouldn't be forced. You can say diversity, but diversity isn't just being different in skin color, it's perspective, it's experience, it's dynamic of like the place that you come from. And I feel like a lot of times in social justice movements, people say, let's put a Black person on that panel because we need diversity, but that person maybe can't speak truth to experience. It's not, Black people aren't generalizations for every community or for that community. We advocate on our own individuality, and for myself, I can only speak on my experience. Before I joined the March for Our Lives movement, I was very, very bitter. I lived in an inner city, Milwaukee, and I know I talked about yesterday of being exposed to so many stressors and that continuous exposure, creating chronic stress and general anxiety for me. And so when that happened, I felt like the movement was very whitewashed. There was no sense of diversity. There was no sense of inclusivity or intersectionality. And I was so bitter because I felt that my community has been actively a part of this conversation for decades, because whenever you think of gun violence, it's always associated with people of color, first thought, and no one ever thought to give us platforms or exposure. So having this continuous stress cycle and not feeling like movements have inclusivity or a platform that to be intersectional, I was like, well, what does intersectionality mean to me? I can't really get mad at a bunch of kids who lived in an affluent area because a mass shooter came to their school. They did what they thought they needed to do in response to that situation. And when they came to my city and I talked to them about that and I joined the road tour with them, that's when that new spark of intersectionality was created, because you cannot blame people or movements for not being diverse when they don't know the realms, they don't know the situations of other areas. And I remember speaking with the Parkland students when I first met them about intersectionality and diversity, and talking about how I tried to create like a 3-point principle of like what I want diversity or intersectionality means, and it's reflection, digestion, and creation. Y'all look tired. Can y'all repeat it? Reflection, digestion, creation. Perfect. So first, reflecting on who you are and your past life, like what have you been learning. And I know for me, like when I lived in an inner city or Milwaukee, I went to school in the outskirts of my city through a busing program so I can get a better education. And with that, I was the only person of color in all my classes, and I would have to always like fight for myself, advocate for myself, and just be sick of not knowing that there was representation in my education or representation within my peers or my teachers. And so having that realization is, okay, I know what it feels like to be the only person of color. I know what it feels like to be a minority, and I know what it feels like to not have representation. Second, digestion, absorbing people and absorbing your issues, absorbing what you reflected, and actually holding yourself accountable for it. You can reflect on your life and you can reflect on like what you went through, but if you're not digesting it and understanding it, you'll never progress forward as an individual, because sometimes it's hard to hold yourself accountable, or it's hard to like confront your demons and the traumas that you faced. But in order to be in a movement where you are representing so many people and advocating for so many people, if you are not digesting your own traumas and digesting those around you and understanding the people that you are advocating for, you will never, you cannot be intersectional or diverse. Absorbing everyone on this panel and listening is so hard for me because I'm an overly sensitive person. I have anxiety, but this is what's important. In order to understand peace and peace building, I need to hear your story, your story, your story, and all the stories in this room, or stories that are similar and familiar to me, because in this movement, we have so many different people and perspectives. So digesting things is going to be hard, but you have to do it if you want to cleanse your mind to understand and progress forward. 3, creativity oh my God, creation, forgot my own principle. Creation, so what are you going to produce? Well, how are you going to be intersectional? Now that you reflect on your past life, you digested things of other people, you're ready to be a part of this movement, and you're ready to be intersectional. But sometimes that's sometimes hard. I mean, if you're a person of privilege, that's when we need to have that conversation too. It's really uncomfortable to have conversations about privilege, but whiteness and social justice movements, white supremacy, all these things, it's so important. Who gets platforms? Who gets coverage? People with lighter skin, people with darker skin, and lives in inner cities do not get as much platform as people who don't. And that's a thing that we need to hold ourselves accountable to as well. What are we going to create and produce for people that we're advocating for? And I know, for example, when I was in high school after the 2016 election, sorry, I'm thinking ahead, when our president was elected into office, lots of people at my school were telling girls of color to go back to their country, were telling girls to take off their hijab, people were calling me the N-word, and all these things, and I felt like young girls of color in my school, we are always told that we have to be silent about the injustice that we're facing. No one wants to hear our issues because the mass majority will never relate to it. Well, that's unfair. That's unfair to tell people who are a part of a minority, who are suffering with injustice every single day, to be silent because the color of their skin determines their value. So I created a website called Honey for Your Tea to give young girls of color the platform to submit stories of oppression, their discrimination, and things that they're suffering with, because we're never asked why or how are you feeling today? How do you feel about this situation or that situation? So creating a place and space for people and not really calling it a safe space, because we don't know people's identities or we don't know people's perceptions of safe spaces. They have to come into these spaces and see if they're safe or not. And so that was really hard for me to be intersectional, because I wanted to understand all different types of people, and I wanted to speak for all types of people, but that's not my place to. My place is to only speak true to my experience and open up my platform, hand the mic to someone else and let them speak truth to their experience. And a lot of, yeah. And I really, really admire like what you said before, and even you as well, about like just women in social justice movements, because we see the history of our country was definitely built on patriarchy and like the fundamentals of what it means to be a man and all those types of things. But it's really hard when you see so many issues happening in the world and there's this huge barricade that's preventing you from actually providing your solutions to the problems that our country is facing because of the color of your skin or your socioeconomic background or living in a very impoverished community. And with that, that creates this cycle of stress and cycle of anxiety. And sometimes when you're an organizer and you're not invited to the table, this cycle of stress and anxiety will prevent you from being intersectional, and you kind of go back into your own silo and just become complacent. And I think with that being said, like, how do we change and shift that narrative? How do we open the doors to people who want to not be sick with stress and anxiety and let them a part of this conversation, and understanding our privilege as people who are being the voices and part of this movement and the peace building movement and have been holding the mic for a long time, like me, I've been talking forever. But like, how do we open up the conversation and let like not even young people, but all people from different walks of life and perspectives? Because yeah, you can make a panel diverse by having this person or this person or this person, but if we're all talking about the same thing and not challenging each other and like voicing our opinions that have some different controversy, then what are we learning? If we all think the same thing, if it's the same people, the same background and same perspective, then what are we learning and what are we changing? That's literally what our country has been doing for 400, how many more years? The same people in the same seats with the same background, same perspectives. You know what I'm talking about, those white bureaucrats in DC and Congress, those white men with the same principles, same narrative, and no one's learning anything. Nothing's being done. No legislation is being passed. That's not intersectional. But we have the platform, we have the power, we have the knowledge. I see people taking notes, and we have the privilege to change and distort that message. We are going to learn things because we're going to be intersectional, and we're not going to force that diversity because that's not how things are progressive. So for sure, intersectional is definitely a word that people just throw out, like I just did like about 10 times, and I don't really think there's like a clear definition, but if we all create that definition and stick to that same narrative, then that's how we will progress forward with peace building and create peace leaders all across the globe.
Thank you for thank you for unpacking that for us in a concrete way and with your examples. I feel like most of the examples we've heard so far are more are these great examples of these surge moments of energy and people taking advantage of, sorry, that's not the right phrasing, but harnessing opportunities to make advances in social change, and often led by youth and in more agile ways than we're used to seeing some of our larger institutions work. Just bringing some of my own bias into the conversation here. But we have Rebecca on the panel, and honestly, we were talking before, I'm actually in some ways just trying to place Rotary in my head about, it's a movement of 1.2 million people, but it's a very different kind of movement perhaps than the examples we've just been looking at, right? And also, was it over 100 years old, right? Or more than that? And so
1905.
1905, all over the world. So we can't even necessarily generalize about some of the demographics of the participants. First, we'd love to hear more about, what is, I think we've all walked by a Rotary sign somewhere in our travels, and not all of us have understood exactly what's going on behind that sign and who's coming together. And there's this wonderful, broader social good mission that is uniting people. But is that also, do all those Rotarians see themselves as part of a peace community? And yeah, please tell us everything. Yeah.
It's really great. I've really enjoyed hearing everyone speak, and I certainly feel that I'm representing probably the somewhat older and more conservative spectrum of what we are doing for movement building. However, I also think there's an important place for everyone to be part of this. So Rotary International, I know that there's definitely people in this room that know who Rotary is, but who would have ever thought that Rotary would be a peace-building organization? Whoever puts them in there, okay, a couple people, okay, good. So Rotary International actually has had the word peace and the underpinnings of peace building in its mission since the early 20th century. So it's actually been, I call it both the oldest yet the newest mission of our organization, because while we've been doing work generally for peace, it's really only been in the last, I would say, well, you can say 18, I really say 5 years, that we have taken a more concrete step into, being a major player within peace building. So if you look, I think have this map behind me, and this is a map I honestly Googled about 2 days ago, because I knew that if I put in, Rotary International programming, I could get a map like this. Because we have a massive infrastructure. We have a built-in movement. We have 1.2 million Rotary members organized in 32,000 clubs. And I know that we talk a lot about, the club model is an old model, but it also still works in so many countries around the world. So we have this massive infrastructure, and so we aren't a surge organization, right? We aren't able to capitalize on some of these pressing issues in the way that other organizations are. But what we can do and what our value is being embedded in communities around the world. So I was talking yesterday about how, Rotary is not a single issue organization, it's a community organization. But peace building is a community initiative. And so who better than Rotarians to be able to take on, some of these issues and be with it for the long haul. Peace building is not a 12-month initiative. It's not a 2-year initiative. It is a 5, 10, 15, 20, 50-year initiative that has peaks and valleys, and you have to be in it for the long term. Now, not to say that it's been super easy to just say, okay, Rotary is now a peace-building organization. Peace-building is complex. It can be political. It can be very difficult to have some of these hard conversations with the demographic that we have, but we are slowly getting there. One of our best-known movements that we've had, in our history is the movement to eradicate polio. And we are still doing that. We are almost at the end. but how we were able to sustain over 30 years that energy and investment from our members. And that really started small. That started in 1979 in the Philippines by one or two Rotarians that saw this problem and dedicated themselves to fixing it. And I don't have a pin with me, and I sometimes laugh about, Rotarians love, it's this old school model, right? We have pins, we donate, we have connection over certain things, but that binds them together to move social good forward. And so what we're doing for the peace building movement within Rotary, because we call it a movement within a movement, is that we are working with our champions, and we are slowly but surely trying to mobilize this infrastructure for peace.
Thank you. Thank you for shedding a bit more light on the Rotary. And I'd love to pick up with everyone here where you were going, Rebecca, in terms of this question of sustaining momentum, right? I think we've all seen what happens when there is a key moment to mobilize around, or even a new powerful documentary to watch, and that word of mouth is powerful, right? There's all kinds of ways in which we get connected and can join these movements and organizations, and but what does it take to sustain participation over time? Because as we know, from the peace building community and from almost every community for working towards lasting change, these things, single movement moments do not usually, I think, yield exclusively in that moment, from that moment, change. They're a key part of the process, right? And so, but the process then often continues for decades, right? So, unfortunately. So I'm curious to hear from all of your experiences, and maybe we can start with any specifics that you have, Rebecca, from the Rotary about, I know some of these people may be engaged for literally, 80 years of their life in the Rotary, and that's very different from, say, the excitement of a political campaign where there's a clear deadline, very clear actions, we're only going to do these one set of things, and it's going to be popular because the media is covering it, and it ends. Whereas, gender equality, we're far from there yet, right? And so, or everything we've talked about so far, ending, violence, peace. So, yeah, what lessons can we take from all of your experiences for sustaining momentum?
I can just say, I think that with the Rotary model, there's an inherent emotional glue that kind of binds people together. They are, again, they meet every week. So they are seeing each other in person every week, and that is challenging, in our modern times. I feel old saying that on this panel, but I think that there is something about that face-to-face interaction that keeps people motivated. They motivate each other to continue to work, and I think that it's certainly possible to do, outside of a club model, but there has to be something that individuals connect in with and can continually connect in with and feel like they're working together on something. But I feel like people need to really be connected to other people.
So there's a relational, social component.
Absolutely.
That's key. It's not just what change are we making, but also, where were you, Rebecca, last week? And
so the last thing I'll say is that I'm always shocked. Rotarians, they love to be around each other. So they could be, not that, they're great people, but, they just love, it's fun for them.
Yeah.
So they're making change and they're also having fun. And I think that that's actually really important.
Yeah, sometimes forget that in organizing. Claire, let's go down the line if we can. Be curious.
Yeah.
And what happened after the particular, people watch? Then,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so I think what's really interesting is that now, in 2019, I've been working on the PAD project for pretty much 7 years, which is a really long time when you think about the grand scheme of my lifetime. I'm only 20, so to give you some context, but to say that sort of the real engagement with our work has skyrocketed in the past year, and I can say that a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that our film won the Oscar. However, thank you. Thank you. But I will say that, in a sense, sort of that accolade acted as sort of a catalyst for the engagement of people with the topic of period poverty. So I think that the most important thing about that was that it created this very public global platform for us to bring our issue to light, and it allowed this sort of connection between what I would, I guess, call sort of like your average person and like this very niche issue. Because I think that a lot of the time why these very pointed social movements can lose momentum is because they have a very niche audience and a very niche group of people working towards them. And so I know that for me, like up until very recently, the PAD project consisted of like 6 people. And they were the 6 people from our school that would sometimes connect with the rare other person talking about period poverty. But once we were able to kind of create this film and use it as a conversation starter and use it as this sort of like web to connect, like I said, you know, the average people who don't necessarily have direct connections or direct awareness or direct involvement in the issue, we were able to identify other people who noticed very similar, that they had similar experiences. People saying, oh, you know, I know of a community in blank location that is suffering from really similar issues that to what you are describing and what you depict in your film. You know, how can I get a hold of one of these pad machines? Or how, you know, I'm a high school student in the US and I have a lot of privilege. Like you were saying, you know, talking about your positions of privilege, I have a lot of privilege and I want to be able to get involved in some way and make an impact. You know, how can I get involved? How can I sponsor a pad machine? We're getting all of these inquiries. I mean, we've been reached out to by over 90 people in 94 countries in almost all 50 states. And so I think that what's really powerful is the fact that the film and the Oscars acted as a way to broaden the audience and to connect more people with our movement. And then I think that what's important to take from that, like you said, you know, the importance of sustainability and maintaining an infrastructure. So at least on the ground in terms of sustainability, I think it's important that we're intentional about the way that we employ tactics to maintain like infrastructure in communities that we're working in, to make sure that we're not just trying to like do this broad sweep and try and fix everything, and in doing that sort of like lose touch and let, you know, things fall through the cracks. And then in terms of maintaining sustainability in the actual movements themselves, I think, like you said, it's really important to engage everyone, to let everyone share their stories, to make it so that these people understand that these, like I said, very niche issues, period poverty, connects in so many interlocking ways to other huge social issues. You know, access to education, gender equality, even, you know, sustainability in terms of the environment, like these massive issues that can be sort of pointed down to a very specific challenge. And so I think it's about understanding how all of these social movements interlock and interrelate, and that keeps momentum going, because it doesn't just feel like you're beating the bush and you're working on a single issue that doesn't feel like it's making any progress, that it's part of something larger and it's part of a larger system, this sort of systematic oppression that results from these grand social inequalities.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Let's, we can applause for that, I think.
Thank you.
Gulala, I'm sure I imagine you have a lot to say after 20 years of organizing. I'm hoping you'll also add a bit about the challenges of sustaining momentum in increasingly in a closed or repressive regime or place, which is not, unfortunately increasing only. It's not exclusive to Pakistan, but I'm sure you have plenty of experience to share with us that would apply as we look at peace building and movement building around the world, where it's just increasingly more difficult to and more dangerous to mobilize, to organize, to communicate about any of the issues we've spoken about today. So yeah, and you've done this at great personal risk as well. So I'm just curious to hear more about how do you sustain momentum, especially under these challenging circumstances?
Thank you. I think it's in every context, different kind of movements emerge, and the sustainability of the movement depends on its context. It's completely different to build movement in a democratic society where people have the right to freedom of expression, where people have the right to freedom to associate, where they have the freedom to use media, to come to the media. And it's completely different to build movements in a country which is fascist, where media is not free, where people are not allowed to associate, to come together, to protest. And if you come together and protest, it will be at the risk of your life. You can be put in prison for months, for years. So it's completely different to organize movements in different contexts. I have experience of organizing, building, and facilitating movements in fascist regime, in a regime where a military establishment has complete control over everything that happens in the country, where constitution gets suspended, and where we have rare constitutional rights to associate, to come together, to protest, and to speak out. However, speaking about from my experience, speaking about sustainability of the movement, when in my context, usually movements are sparked by some incidents, when something really bad happens and it brings together people, because it is not easy for people to come together in fascist regime, and something really wrong, bad has to happen to bring people together. Like, for example, in 2017 in Pakistan, this one young man was killed whose name was Naqib Masood. He was killed in a fake encounter by the police, and he was a really handsome guy who aspired to become a model, so people knew him that he is not a terrorist. He was killed in a fake encounter. He was speaking for peace. He was called a terrorist, and he was killed. So it was his murder that sparked protests all over the country. People from all over the country, they came together. They built a movement asking for Truth and Reconciliation Commission, asking for putting an end to extrajudicial killing, asking for an end to enforced disappearances. But however, there is, whenever any movement starts, there is a bandwagon appeal to it. It's trendy to be part of such movements. It becomes trendy to be part of movements. But what happens when the bandwagon appeal is gone? Then how do you sustain the movement? It is then really hard work to actually keep the movement going on, to keep, even when it is not trendy, how to stay with the movement. That requires a lot of teamwork. It is so important for any movement to have team of strong leaders and diverse leaders, not just one kind of, like, one thing that I learned from the movement was that I found, in this movement, that all of a sudden there was civil society, there were feminists, there were even religious clerics in the movement, all of us who had lived such different lives, but we were bonded together with the aim to get ourselves the right to life. And that is what bonded different people us together. Another important thing that I learned about sustainability of the movement is that movement create leaders, but it is so important to keep on the process of developing, to continue the process of developing leadership. It is so important to have second line leadership, third line leadership, fourth line leadership. Movements are like trains. When a train is, it's more like, I think already so many people have talked about it, that movements are like train. They stop at, they stop at different bus stops. Some people will get off, new people will join the movement, and at the end, when it's achieving its goal, there will be few people. Many people would have already gotten off from the train. So that's how movements are. People who have started the movement, they might not be with the movement at the end, but if it is producing new leaders, if it facilitates new people to join movement, then it will sustain, it will continue. Another lesson that I have learned from what sustains movement, as I already talked about, it's about inclusion of women. Women are half of the world. Any movement, especially when it comes to peace building, in most communities, in most countries, we think that conflicts are so much associated with men. And because conflicts are seen, of course, they are manifestation of toxic masculinities. So whenever it comes to peace building and conflict resolution, most of us think that maybe it's about men, even when it comes to recruitment by militant organizations or foreign recruitment, like by Daesh or ISIS. But peace building is not just about men, it's about women as well. And from our work with the Aware Girls, we have already proved that what young women can do to build peace in their communities. Young women can, they can counter Talibanization, they can counter extremism, they can challenge the most fascist regimes in their country. So women are so crucial to peace building. If women are not part of peace building processes, I'm not sure how does that movement, I think a movement cannot sustain with women not just being at center of it and at the forefront of it, but also a peace movement shall address women's issues as well, how conflict is affecting women. For example, in Pakistan, we have this issue of enforced disappearances. More than 40,000 people have become victims of enforced disappearances. Most of them are men. But however, when we speak about issues of enforced disappearances, it's also important to speak about for any movement at how it is affecting women. Because in our communities, mostly these men are the sole earners of their families. So when they become victims of enforced disappearances, their right to free and fair trial they're deprived from their right to free and fair trial, from their right to justice. However, a whole family is also affected, and no one speaks about the family. Now the family has no one to earn for them. Children cannot go to school. Women had not been in patriarchal society. Women did not have access to education. They were not given the capacity to earn, and all of a sudden they are there in this brutal society, and they have to earn, they have to send children to their school, they have to maintain a home. So that is also so important to speak about how this whole conflict is affecting women, and how do we make sure that women issues are raised in the conflict. Also, it is the most important issue that I want to highlight is that it is so important to build peace movements and movements for social justice, but I will focus on when we talk about how do we sustain peace movements. We cannot sustain peace movements if people who are building the movement, if they are not safe, if there is no safety net for the peace builders. I am a woman peace builder. For last 20 years, I have been almost 20 years, I have been working on countering extremism, peace building, but I have also been working on human rights. And what I have witnessed is that when it comes to peace builders, is there a safety net? Is there any mechanism to protect us? Last 2 years for me had been very difficult. I was persecuted both by the state actors and by the non-state actors. Because of my peace work, first I was accused of blasphemy. There was a whole 4 months online campaign against me, accusing me of blasphemy. And in Pakistan, if someone accuses a woman of blasphemy, you can be killed in mob lynching, and no one will even ask for your right to justice. It is such a dangerous campaign. But what was out there? Like, was there? I don't think so that there were enough local, national, or international mechanisms to protect me. But even when there was a blasphemy campaign against me, I decided that I'm going to stay in Pakistan and I will fight back. I'm not going to give my space to someone. I will not silence myself just because few random people are accusing me of blasphemy. So I fought a legal battle. I went to the court. I booked the people running campaign against me in police cases. But then what happened that, as I said, in 2018, this new movement started in Pakistan, Pashtun Thavas movement, and the movement was asking about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate the human rights abuses committed in the tribal areas during the counter-terrorism military operations, to investigate about human rights abuses such as enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killing. As Rebecca was already saying that peace building can be political, I think that it not can be political, it's always political. Peace is always political, and that is why when it comes to peace builders, there aren't enough safety mechanisms for peace builders, because everyone thinks that, oh, this is political and maybe we don't want to touch, this is too political, our organizations can get suspended. Donors think that we won't be able to work in a certain country if we are, when I was at risk, I know that there were some brave organizations like Alliance for Peace Building and Peace Direct and some other organizations who were very brave, who stood with me. Just to give you a bit of background, for last 1 year I was persecuted for asking for peace building, for taking part in the protests which were asking for Peace, Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I was called a terrorist. I have been booked in around 8 police cases under anti-terrorism laws of Pakistan. While you know me as a peace activist, but in Pakistan today I am the most wanted terrorist. Courts have just yesterday, the courts have issued order of my most wanted, and there will be newspapers ads, and there will be like ads all around the country to find me, because I'm the most wanted terrorist. So when you work for peace, you will be called as a terrorist. But when you are called as a terrorist, my life was at risk. Who was there to protect me? Where are the mechanisms? There were few organizations only who stood with me and who issued statements with me. Most of the organizations thought, no, this is political. We will not be allowed to work in Pakistan if we stood with Gulali. No, we shall stay silent. And let's see, my sister, when I was for past 4 months, I was in Pakistan, I was in hiding, and my sister was crazily, she was trying to reach out to everyone to support me. And because my life was at risk, I was put on a state kill list. And if we were told from multiple sources that if Pakistan security agencies want to kill anyone, that's Gulali. She's on the top of the kill list. And my sister was crazily reaching out to everyone. There were cases against me, so I went into hiding. And she was told by so many people that, we cannot do anything at this moment, but if she get arrested, then we will be in a position to advocate for her. Like, come on. You wait for a peace activist to go to prison and get tortured and abused, and then you can say, oh, release Gulali Ismail, release Gulali Ismail. No. If we want peace movement to sustain, then we need to develop locally, nationally, and internationally, we need to develop safety nets for peace builders. 1 month ago, after all this happened, I had to flee my country. I flee country illegally, and I'm proud of it for taking an illegal trip to come out of Pakistan to save my life and to make sure that people are able to hear my voice. But that's what I wanted to say, that peace builders are at the center of peace building. If we as international community keep on failing peace builders, then we cannot sustain peace movement. I was a famous person, already known for my work, because for past 20 years I was well known in the peace building community, but not everyone will be well known in the international community. What happens to them? What happens to the people who do not make it to the Twitter trend? I always made it to the Twitter trend when I was persecuted, but not every peace activist will make it to the top Twitter trend. And we need to build mechanisms for those who does not have a sister like me, for those who does not have partners like Alliance for Peace Building and Peace Direct. We need to build mechanisms for those unknown thousands of young peace builders who are out there and who are risking their lives, so that all of us can live in a peaceful world. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm glad you could be here safely in this moment to share this story with us, but I think it's also really important and helpful for us all to hear the risks that continue for peace builders and activists and human rights defenders everywhere that I think does not get enough attention, so I appreciate that. I want to ask folks to start, I want to get the mic moving here in a second, and as we do that, ask Bria to come in on this question too, perhaps briefly, but on, I had a great question for you, but I was wrapped up a minute ago. Let's see. Oh, I think the question, what I was curious about is post March for Our Lives, it's the same question on sustaining momentum. Just curious to see how you see the relationship between some of the big, there were some big national organizations that were involved, I'll just use the word generally, right, in March for Our Lives as that momentum was building, and then, before, during, and after. And I don't want to characterize any of their roles. I'm just curious how you see, and you work also inside the Milwaukee City Council and or the Youth Council. So I'm just curious to get your hot take on what is the relationship between some of the movement efforts and some of the traditional organizations when it comes to sustaining, or some of the larger organizations that have been around for a lot longer than movement efforts in sustaining momentum. Is there a recipe?
Well, first off, everything you said, I was like, yeah, that's so true, because when you think of sustainability, it does differ in every dynamic. What does it mean to be, because if we're trying to sustain social justice, well, the injustice is also sustaining itself, because perpetrators and oppressors are working actively, and they're meeting more than we are maybe, to keep that narrative, to keep sustaining their injustice and keep sustaining their negative impacts on communities. But post-March for Our Lives, and I'll say this briefly, I think lots of national attention was covering that event. Parkland shooting, we are always talking about events, big national coverage, the El Paso shooting, the shooting at Christchurch, the shooting, all these different shootings and mass shootings, but we never focus on events that happen every single day that also perpetuates the same cycle of oppression. But I think with March for Our Lives and sustaining that narrative, we have so many different organizers in different states. We have regional directors, we have chapter leads, we have volunteers, we have Moms Demand Action, we have different people who are coming in this conversation and sustaining this narrative, because after yesterday or 2 days ago, the gun violence prevention, gun violence is the topic of the presidential 2020 election, and that's a big freaking deal. That's never been a big topic, because politicians never wanted to legislate against gun violence or wanted to put that as a big thing in their campaign. But that's sustainment, that's sustainability. We're having this conversation over and over, and we're not just doing it in response to events, in response to actions, in response to racists going into people of color grocery stores and killing everyone that they see. We don't do it in response to that. We do it in response to one action that happened to us individually and working passionately so it doesn't happen again. And like you say before, we'll help you when you're arrested. And I feel at times, in this movement, we're always waiting for, we'll do this if this happens. We'll do this if this happens. But we never know what's going to happen. We never know how our response or the resources that we'll have if the event does occur. So I think that sustainability within March for Our Lives, I was just appointed my board member position earlier this year, so I was able to see how just the behind the works of this organization and how it does have national attention, but we need to activate even more young people. Last year, March for Our Lives was the topic of almost everything political that young people were talking about, because gun violence, it was a big issue that people were afraid to go to school. And I think just even this year too, we have the same fear, and having that conversation and keeping it alive and activating people to actually make a change and go into their roles and their positions, and not just being a leader, but if you're not really a leader, if you're not making your followers leaders as well. That's how the whole topic of sustainability happens, is because we're actively learning ourselves and putting ourselves in these positions. But we need to make sure that people who are looking up to us, that are following us, are actually doing the same things, because they need to become leaders as well, and go to their silos and in their communities and represent the information that they learn. So sustainability within this movement, definitely, I would say I'm very hopeful, because after that event, to see politicians this will be one of the most revolutionary democratic election next year. We have so many people of color, or just Kamala. We have people in this election who are racing that transverse all different lines, and now this topic is on their radar, and we're able to have that conversation of sustainability, because that's something that's never happened.
Thank you. Claire, can you pass the mic? So I'd love to see, Rebecca's going to chime in on this quickly too, but I want to maybe surface just a handful of questions, and then we can use that as a closing round as well. So yeah, in our kind of final 5 minutes here. So go ahead, Rebecca, and then also if people can start showing their hands to the gentleman with the mic in the front, who can keep an eye on a couple of people. Yeah?
I just want to follow up on what Bria said about narrative, because we didn't actually talk specifically about that, but I think in terms of sustaining movements, not for both reducing violence and increasing peace, proactively creating narratives around this is really, really important, because then you are creating the story that keeps people engaged even when we don't have these surges that bring people together. It's something that we're always doing day in and day out to create something that sustains people's interest. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you. A couple questions that you have, and we're going to build that into a closing round here. We have a question up front, and let's get a couple more
Thank you.
on cue. Yeah.
My name is Vivian Lowry Derrick, and I run the Bridges Institute, which focuses on strengthening African governance and democracy. I want to thank this panel because I'm a grown-up that you have inspired to become even more active and to reach out to other grown-ups because of the power of all of you. My question is for Claire. Claire, with the film, you've given a gift to girls' education everywhere. 3 out of 4 girls leave school in Uganda at 6th grade because of the problem of menstruation. So I think that this is something that really, and your phrase, poverty, period poverty, is something that we can all relate to. My question is, because it's natural that we menstruate, and so it's a matter of health, it's a matter of education, it's a matter of peace, and it's a matter of economic development too, because the people that make these pads become empowered economically in their families and in their communities. So I'm wondering if you can take what you have done and work with other organizations that are focused on peace, like the organizations surrounding you. I mean, I don't know whether Rotary or Galala or Bria's organizations would be interested in this, but why not have a kind of coalition of all kinds of organizations, because this is important for literally everybody, and the sustainability is that we're human, and this is going to be with us as long as there are human beings. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe before you answer, I just want to see if there's anything else we want to surface in the room. Let's get one more here. And we'll do one more back there, and then, yeah, thanks.
Hi, my name is Noor Ghazi. I am from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. I'm also an Iraqi peace activist, and I relate to some of the things that you have talked about. One thing that I want to mention is it's been 3 days in Iraq. A great movement has been taken against the corruption of the Iraqi government, and they have been faced with live bullets, with all type of violence against Iraqi people. So my question for you, and from your perspective, and as you have mentioned that many movements had been happening in Pakistan in the past, how can we sustain such a movement in Iraq? And what is our role as a peace activist in the United States to have our voice heard in the national communities? Because today we're facing also difficulties of getting that voice heard. And I want to hear from you, from your perspective and your experience. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I think we had one more whose hand is still up there. Sorry to make you run. And then we will, I think what we'll do is give everyone a chance to comment on what feels most meaningful. Some questions were directed, and then we'll use that as our closing round thoughts.
On David Steele, Brandeis University. All of you have given such powerful stories, narratives of developing movements, mostly around advocacy. And I've been part of that too, in my experience. But I'm wondering about what are the kinds of guidelines you might provide for other kinds of roles, building movements around other kinds of peace-building roles. I think probably Rebecca, more than others, is maybe can address that, but my question is to everybody. For example, conciliation, mediation, education. Some of you maybe have touched on that in some aspects. There are a whole lot of different roles, many of which might require something different than counting on a surge moment, particular event that one is responding to.
Great. Thank you for those questions. I also know that some of you can smell coffee brewing from there better than we can here, so we are going to give you or ask that our panelists offer, in answering these questions, also some closing thoughts to leave you with and closing reflections for our peace building community here. And so, yeah, why don't we start with you, Rebecca, and go down the line.
Okay, I think I'll go ahead and address the question that was just asked. Around, in my mind, that's really like, what can we do to broaden the pool of people that consider themselves peace builders and how they work in peace building? Most of the organizations being from we do some advocacy, but really being from a non-political, non-religious, non-advocacy standpoint, I think that we, as Rotary and working with other organizations, we're really trying to build, and we're also trying to create narratives within our own organization and looking at how our members can work in so many different avenues in their community to build peace. So they are educators, they are part of local government, they are working in business, and how they can use those platforms to create peace. In terms of education, like Rotary is actually one of the biggest funders of peace education globally. So we certainly are advancing in those areas. But our goal, I think, over the last 3 years and then moving forward is to really broaden this definition of what it is to be a peace builder, but at the same time, have it come into a common narrative, because then you don't feel like you're just kind of doing these things in a silo. And I think that that's a challenge, but that's what we're trying to do, somewhat in the microcosm of Rotary, and then seeing how that can be applied to, the larger global community.
Thank you. Claire.
So yeah, I'll go ahead and answer, Vivian, your question. So I think that it's really, really important when working in social impact to understand sort of when it's best to tackle an issue yourself, when it's best to be the one directly doing the work, or when it's better to partner with other organizations that might be better at specializing in something specifically than you might be. So in the case, for example, when we started working on the PAD project and we were first working to identify a community that would be best to partner with, we partnered with an Indian NGO, Action India, to connect us with some of the communities that they had been working with on the ground. They knew better than we did. We weren't trying to impose and say, we know everything about this issue. We know exactly where we should try and, drop down and begin working. It was really about doing pointed research and understanding where the needs were, how the needs could be met, and where we could specifically go to have the most impact. So in that case, that was one of the most meaningful partnerships. We partnered with the Feminist Majority Foundation to develop this larger network of activists and scholars and empowered women and feminists to expand our boundaries and to make our movement more inclusive. I think it would be incredible to connect with other people up here and to connect with other movements that have similar missions, especially because, like I was saying, period poverty is one fraction of the larger contribution to gender inequality and the disempowerment of women and the lack of inclusivity in social movements. And so I think that by partnering with other organizations that maybe approach that same larger framework from a different angle could make all of the movements, all of the organizations partnering much broader, and I think take a much more holistic approach at the work. At the same time, I think for the PAD project to partner with a major sanitary pad brand like Always or Kotex, I think would be huge. I think to bring it to a larger scale and get these big corporations, get them to hold themselves accountable. I think that
I'm
would
going
be
to
a
ask you to leave
phenomenal
it there
thing.
if you don't mind.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
of course, of course. But so, yeah, I think that partnerships are incredibly important. And I think for us to partner up here with one another and find commonalities in our narratives, like you were saying, is really, really important to sort of connect the larger network of activists and peace builders. Yeah.
Great points. Thank you. Kulala.
Thank you so much for your question. I think that the most difficult movements are the one from which fascist regimes and bigger corporations, mafia, feel threatened. In our situations like ours, the states have much more privilege and leverage because they control media, they control state resources, they control the narrative. They sit in the United Nations, they sit in the bilateral meetings, and they give the world a narrative. The policymakers most of the time get to hear narratives of the state, of the fascist regimes, and not what the people on the ground have to say. And I think that in such cases, like in ours, diaspora community has such a huge role to play. I think diaspora communities shall always organize and provide this kind of like parallel movement because they are much more like they're less at risk. When you are a diaspora community, you are less at risk, but you are from that community and you can raise all those issues while being out of your country. So I think diaspora community shall play their role. Other thing is for movements like us is to stick with non-violence. The fascist regimes know the language of violence. They have organized militaries. They have organized. They have a whole war economy. They have guns. They know the language of violence. They are expert in it. And movements, they can never win through violence. So it is so important for movements of peace building, social justice movement to stick with non-violence, no matter how much the state tries to push us towards violence by engaging in violence against us. When crackdown against us started, while I was called as a terrorist and I was booked in different cases, other activists from the same movement, there were attempts to kill them. There were firing on the shooting attempt was done on them. 15 of them got killed. But even then, the movement decided that no matter that even if 14 of us are killed, 1,400 of us are killed, or 14,000 of us will be killed, we will stick with non-violence because our language is non-violence and we can only win through non-violence.
I might ask you, I think we're about to get peacefully removed from the stage
I'm trying
at this
so
time.
hard.
So if you're willing to stay around for comments afterwards, I know there are some more questions. Can I ask Bria to bring us home here for
Bria, bring us home.
a final words of wisdom?
I just want to echo everything that these phenomenal queens said before me, but I think one thing that I would leave you guys with is just really understanding the three-point principle of like reflection, digestion, and creation. What can you reflect on as an individual? What can you digest from others? And what can you create in part of our peaceful dialogue? But for sure, just understanding your energies. And I know a lot of the times my mom's like, Bria, stop doing panel after panel, go to college, you're paying for this. And that's true, but like there's also things that I kind of like distort into my own obligation. Like it's our obligation almost to be peace builders and to be revolutionary changers in our communities and take what we learn in this space and actually leave the doors and have the message that we're like saying to you, let it resonate with you and have purpose. Because if we're just sitting in here staring at each other, why did any of us come if we're not here to learn, go back to our communities, start learning what peace is and actually like reflecting on what we learned. But I think for sure, just as activists and as peace builders, understanding what peace within yourself means first, because you cannot advocate for peace if you're not peace within yourself, if your energy is not taken care of, if you haven't got enough sleep, if you're not eating. Because like I know a lot of times we act like activists have to just be ready for everything, but there's things that we can say no to, and there's things that we can decline. But for sure, reflection, digestion, creation, and just understanding how we all have impact and what our roles are in this movement. And it's not a individual thing. It's not what the young people are going to do to save the rest of our lives, but it's what we're going to do collective, forming coalitions, working with organizations, having very uncomfortable but healthy conversations, and understanding our privilege and how each one of us can make a difference within this movement.
Woo! Thank you so much.
Round of applause. Thank you all for. It was an honor and privilege to be sharing this stage with you all. Thank you for sharing all of your wisdom and experiences with us today. Round of applause, please.
Thank you. And thank you all. We ate into your break. Our next sessions will have to actually start a little bit later because as yesterday, please, if you could leave this area so that they can put the divider up, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you all. Okay, that was so exciting. I know.